Cenk Uygur recently appeared on the Brilliant Idiots podcast where he stated that the Tower of Babel was his breaking point for religion, and then proceeded to give his interpretation of the story. Now, this show is not about politics, it's mythology, and this is not an attack against Cenk, but the reality is that he has influence over millions of people on his platform, the Young Turks. And this was a horrific reading of the Tower of Babel, and it needs to be addressed. So I'm going to play the clip, it's roughly 30 seconds, and then address it from a text-critical perspective. I'll do a video of the historicity in the future, and I want to stress there's no theology in this. It's simply a dive into what the text actually says. By the way, guys, I'm Brad. I'm a PhD candidate in biblical studies. Here we go.
So this kid's almost literal. So I read a whole bunch of the Quran, and great parts in there, but tons of that doesn't make sense. Then I'm like, maybe the Bible's got it figured out, right? So I start reading it, and I'm just getting the foreskin, and we're sprinkling goat's blood everywhere, and it's madness. I get to the Tower of Babel story, and I'm like, wait, let me get this right. Humans worked together, built this beautiful tower, okay? And God was jealous, and then he knocked the tower down, and he made all of us speak different languages, so we couldn't work together anymore. And I'm like, okay, if that God exists, then I'm against it.
I get it. I can understand that. That makes perfect sense.
Now, what's funny about this clip is you can see there at the very end, Andrew Schulz, who's sitting on his right, screen's left, raises his hands up, and he does press him on this issue, but he goes straight to the New Testament to do it. But it's a humorous exchange if you want to check it out. Now, I'm going to read a short section of the Tower of Babel story from Genesis chapter 11. The whole story is only about 9 verses to provide some context before diving into the details. And this is starting in verse 1. Now, the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, or Shinar, as we say in English, and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks, and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower, with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." Now, I'm going to focus on 2 key terms here that the biblical author is strategically using to grab your attention. And the first one of these is the east, where it says that people migrated from the east, and then they settled in a plain called Shinar. Shinar is going to be the second term. So why the east? Why are they coming from the east? Well, this is supposed to draw us back to the Garden of Eden narrative. The Garden of Eden was not the entire land of Eden. Rather, it was a garden within the land of Eden, and the garden was to the east. What ends up happening is that when Adam and Eve were banished from the Garden of Eden, they were banished east because of their disobedience. And then they have 2 sons, Cain and Abel. And Cain ends up murdering his brother Abel. And after Cain does this to his brother, he is banished east to the land of Nod. And he is a wanderer. There's actually a word play on the word wanderer and the word Nod in Hebrew. But this brings us to the preface of the Tower of Babel story, where the people have one language and the same words, and they migrated from the east. Just like these other figures that we've looked at who migrated east because of some act of disobedience. And then these people gather together in the land of Shinar and settle there. And what's interesting about this is that humanity has been commanded twice. First in Genesis 1, then directly after the flood with Noah and his family to, quote, "be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." So by settling in one place, in Shinar, humanity is actually being disobedient. And furthermore, Shinar is important because it links the story of Babel to a rebellious human named Nimrod. And if we go back just 1 chapter previous in Genesis, what we find is this man named Nimrod. He is a son of Cush, who is a descendant of Ham, Noah's rebellious son, who sexually violated his father, which was actually a sexual act against his mother, and I'll cover that in another video in the future as well. That's often mistaken for a homosexual act against his father, and that's not what the text implies. But it was stated that Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That word mighty, Gibor, this is the author making a direct link to another line of rebellious individuals, because this is the second occurrence of this word Gibor within the biblical text. And the first occurrence is in Genesis 6:4, where the text states that the Nephilim were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So this is directly linking Nimrod to Noah's rebellious son and the Nephilim, the offspring of the rebellion of the sons of God. And the text goes on in Genesis 10 to state that the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom is Babel. And there's 3 additional cities as well. And these are all in the land of Shinar. And so the biblical author or authors have been strategic in his or their wording leading up to this story. And the original audience would not have been thinking, wow, humans are about to do something great and beautiful. Rather, they would have been thinking the exact opposite, that something bad is about to happen. It's shaping up to be a repeat cycle of human rebellion, just like Adam and Eve, Cain, the pre-flood, Ham. You get the picture. So we've talked in some detail about how the terms East and Shinar are indicating to the reader that the narrative that is about to occur, which is the Tower of Babel in this case, is shaping up to be another act of human disobedience. So let's keep going. These humans start to make bricks and mortar, and just reiterating Genesis 11, it says, "Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.'" Now there's two key terms in this verse, and they are city and tower. We're going to talk about the tower first. Now within biblical scholarship, it's virtually unanimous that the tower being referenced here is what is known as a ziggurat. And a ziggurat was a very specific type of tower and religious structure that was meant to tame or house the deity. Ziggurats were divine abodes. They were places where Mesopotamians believed heaven and earth intersected, and the nature of this structure makes it evident that the purpose in building it is to bring the divine down to earth. So if you want to think about it in this sense, how are they going to make a name for themselves? Well, they're going to construct a city and this tower, and specifically in regard to this tower, it's going to make them a great city because they are going to be the house of the deity. They are going to be the place where if you want to worship the deity, we have that deity in our control. That deity lives here because we built the place for them here. We have them tamed. So if you want to worship that deity, come here. And so you can begin to see how this is not just God being upset that humans decided that they could work together and accomplish great things. Because what they're doing is actually constructing a tower for their own name, fame, and glory. Now let's talk about the city. Because along with the connections to the tower, Shinar, Nimrod, and the East, the city stands in sharp contrast to the biblical story of God and humanity dwelling together. More specifically to the garden and the land of Eden. So if you remember Cain from earlier, the same Cain who murdered his brother Abel and was forced to flee east. It says in Genesis chapter 4, and I'm going to paraphrase, but this narrative starts in verse 17, that after fleeing east, Cain knew his wife, which means they were intimate, to produce offspring, or a son in this case. And by the way, if you're wondering where Cain's wife came from, there is an explanation that does not involve incest, which I will do in a future video. But what Cain does is Cain constructs the first city. And there's debate in scholarship as to who the city is named after. Typically, it's translated as being named after his son, Enoch. But from this city, there are good things that come. There's the invention of music, there's metalworking, and animal domestication. But this city ultimately becomes the place of human violence. And this is exactly what Babel symbolizes, because the city of Cain has been a build-up to the city and the Tower of Babel. And so the city in general terms and the Tower of Babel sit in direct contrast to the paradise garden in Eden, where there were no walls necessary for protection and an abundance of food. And it was the place where humanity and God dwelt together in harmony. And part of the overall biblical narrative is God taking this concept of a city and bringing the paradise garden of Eden to the city. This is essentially what Jerusalem becomes, because the temple within Jerusalem is filled with garden imagery. And in fact, in Isaiah chapter 56, starting in verse 6, it states this, "And the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord, to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants. Everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it, and holds fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain," that's in Jerusalem, "and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. The Lord God, who gathers the outcasts of Israel, declares, I will gather yet others to him, besides those already gathered." And I understand this is the book of Isaiah and we've been in Genesis, but the point I'm making here is that while the city does stand in direct contrast to the paradise garden, when you're comparing the Genesis account, you can see that the city is not entirely evil. And then in fact, within the biblical text, God does have plans to establish a city where his temple will be built and where heaven will meet earth. But what we're looking at in the Tower of Babel narrative is a city that has been constructed aligning to Cain's version of what a city is, rather than what God had called humanity to do. And I think the best summary that I can provide for this short take on the Tower of Babel narrative comes from the late biblical scholar Dr. Michael Heiser, who had one of the most compelling takes on the Tower of Babel. And he says this, that passage, now he's talking about Genesis 6, 1 through 4, that we mentioned earlier with the Nephilim, and he's going to loop that into the Tower of Babel narrative. That passage sought to portray the giant quasi-divine Babylonian cultural heroes, the Apkallu, who survived the flood as men of renown, or more literally, men of the name, in Hebrew Shem. Those who built the Tower of Babel wanted to do so to make a name, Shem, for themselves. The building of the Tower of Babel meant perpetuating Babylonian religious knowledge and substituting the rule of Babel's gods for rule by Yahweh. And the reason this hits the nail on the head is because you can see this is the exact opposite of what Cenk was claiming. Babel was not humanity coming together to do something great and God being jealous that humans were working together and then simply knocking over their tower that they'd worked so hard and scattering them across the earth for no reason. This was the ultimate act of rebellion, and it ultimately led to Yahweh dispersing the nations to the rule of lesser divine beings. And if you want more on that, you need to read Dr. Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm, or the little bit lighter version of that, Supernatural. And again, guys, I really want to stress this has not been a personal attack on Cenk in any way, shape, or form. This has simply been a textual data-driven approach to the Tower of Babel, because the interpretation that Cenk provided is essentially the opposite of what the story is actually trying to communicate. All right, everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to like, subscribe, and check out this video that YouTube thinks you're going to like. And one final note on this Cenk Uygur video. The conversation proceeded to take a turn after this where Charlamagne stated that Constantine was the one that created Christianity and essentially needed Jesus to be the face and figure of it, to which after some tense rebuttal from Andrew Schulz, Cenk came in and essentially said, yeah, Charlemagne's correct on this. And if you want to see some individuals absolutely debunk that, you can check out individuals such as Bart Ehrman, who has talked numerous times on this, or if you're someone that wants more of an apologetic flavor behind it, you can check out what Wes Huff has had to say. And spoiler alert, both of them say essentially the exact same thing, because there's really no debate when it comes to that. All right, everyone, I'm really out this time. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on the next one.